daughter's grave. So his father decided to hide a hidden camera. But what he saw in the recording changed his heart forever and made him burst into tears. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching us from. The man had lived a long life of labor and struggle, his skin darkened by the sun and his hands hardened by decades of carrying burdens heavier than any man should endure. His name was never important to the world beyond his small neighborhood, but to his daughter, he had been everything. She had been his pride, his joy. The single bright flame that had kept him walking forward after death had already robbed him once of happiness when his wife passed away many years earlier. He had poured everything he had into raising his girl, sheltering her from the cruelty of the world, teaching her to be strong but also kind, to laugh even when life gave her little reason to smile. She had grown up in a modest house on the edge of town, far from luxury, but wrapped in the warmth of her father's love. He had worked on construction sites when his back was young enough to bear the weight of bricks, on farms when his muscles had been firm and steady, in warehouses when there was nothing else to do but lift until sweat blurred his eyes. Every aching bone, every scar across his hands was, to him, a badge of honor. Proof that he had done what he must to provide for her. She would meet him at the door after long shifts, her laughter filling the air, her small hands tugging at his sleeves as she showed him her newest drawings. Bright flowers on scrap paper, suns with crooked rays, childish hearts that always had his name in the center. She gave him reasons to endure, to believe there was something beautiful still left for him. Then the illness came, like a thief in the night. At first it was nothing more than a fever, the kind any child might get. He sat at her bedside, placing a damp cloth across her forehead, whispering prayers he had not spoken in years. He believed it would pass, the way childhood sicknesses always seemed to. But the fever returned, heavier, and soon there were hospital visits, doctors with grave eyes, words he did not understand but felt in his bones to be terrible. He sold his car, emptied his small savings, begged for extra hours at work, anything to keep her treatment going. He sat for nights in the harsh light of hospital corridors, his body slumped but his soul alert, listening for any word from the doctors, any scrap of hope. He would have given his life without hesitation if it meant hers could be spared. Yet there are battles that cannot be fought with strength or endurance. One morning, in a sterile white room, her small hand slipped from his. Her breath faded into silence, and he felt the world collapse beneath him. It was as if the very air had been taken from his lungs. The pain did not come as a sharp blow, but as a crushing weight that spread through every part of him until he was hollow, a man walking but no longer living. He remembered her last smile, faint and tired, but still trying to comfort him, as though she knew he would suffer more than she. That smile burned into his memory, a wound that would never close. The funeral was a blur, yet also unbearably vivid. He had insisted on a proper burial, though it cost him everything he had left. The casket was of white wood polished until it shone, lined with fabric soft as if to cradle her in comfort she would never feel again. He placed inside it her favorite doll, the one she had carried since she was a toddler, and a stack of her drawings bound with string. Neighbors and distant relatives came, murmuring words of sympathy that felt thin against the roaring emptiness in his chest. When the time came to close the casket, he could not let go. His fingers clutched the edge, knuckles white, his body trembling as though by sheer force of will he could keep her with him. They had to gently take his hands away, and when the lid closed, he thought the light of the world closed with it. At the cemetery, he stood with bowed head as earth covered her coffin. The sound of shovels striking dirt was like the tearing of flesh. A simple marble cross was placed at the head of the grave, her name etched into it, forever marking a life too brief. When the others left, he remained, unable to step away, staring at the mound of fresh soil until night fell and the caretaker quietly urged him to go. He walked home that night like a shadow, his house now colder and emptier than the graveyard itself. The days that followed blurred into one another, but he found himself returning to the cemetery again and again. At first it was once a week, then every few days, until it became every morning and every evening, as though by being near her resting place he could somehow draw strength to continue. He would bring flowers, not store-bought, but picked from the edges of roadsides or given by neighbors who pitied him. Sometimes he brought small toys she had cherished or little trinkets he knew she loved. He arranged them carefully, talking softly as though she might hear him. He spoke to her as if she were simply sitting across from him, the way she had at the dinner table. He told her about the weather, about the ache in his joints, about how he missed her laughter echoing in the house. He confessed the loneliness that sat like a stone in his chest, how he woke each morning expecting her footsteps in the hall. He begged for signs that she was still with him, even in some small way. Each word spilled into the air like prayers to a silent heaven. At times, he felt foolish, an old man speaking to the earth, but he could not stop. Those conversations were the only moments he felt alive, tethered to something more than sorrow. The cemetery became less a place of death and more a place of communion, where he could sit in the presence of memory and pretend, for a little while, that she was not gone. But as the weeks passed, his grief remained a wound that refused to heal. He moved like a ghost through the world, eating little, sleeping only when exhaustion forced him. His hands, once steady from years of labor, shook when he tried to hold a cup. His neighbors watched him with pity, but none could reach him, for his heart lived only at that grave. He carried her absence like a second skin, invisible but suffocating. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, he sat once more by the grave, his hands clasped, his voice cracking with words half prayer, half conversation. He promised her he would never stop coming, that as long as he drew breath, she would never be alone. And as darkness gathered, he whispered the same sentence he had spoken every night since her passing, words that had become his anchor. "You are still my little girl, and I will never leave you." That vow bound him to the grave more tightly than chains, setting the stage for everything that would follow. In his grief, he had built a ritual, a rhythm to his days. He believed nothing could disturb this fragile connection he maintained. Yet soon, small disturbances would begin to crack the stillness of his mourning, signs that something was not right, that even in the silence of death, the world could intrude in ways he could never have imagined. The days of mourning had melted into months, and still the old man followed the same path, his feet knowing the way to the cemetery as if it were the only road left in the world. He carried flowers when he could afford them, toys that had once belonged to his daughter, or small mementos he thought she might like. Placing them gently by the marble cross, he felt a measure of peace return to him, a fleeting comfort that softened the endless ache in his chest. These visits became his lifeline. The grave was not simply a resting place for the girl he had lost, but a sacred ground where his love for her lived on in tangible form. For a time, nothing disturbed this fragile routine. He would sit by the grave, speaking to her as though she still sat across from him at the table, her laughter bright in his ears. He confessed his loneliness, his memories, his promises never to forget her. Yet, one morning, as he arrived with a fresh bouquet, his heart stilled when he saw the ground before him. The flowers he had placed only the day before were gone, not withered or scattered, not blown away by the wind, but vanished entirely, as though they had never been there. The space before the cross looked bare, unnaturally so. At first, he told himself perhaps the wind had been strong, or animals had dragged them away in the night. It was a cemetery, after all, and stray cats sometimes roamed among the stones. He replaced the bouquet with another and left, telling himself not to dwell on it. But the next day, the same thing happened. Again, the flowers were gone. His heart beat harder in his chest, though he tried to rationalize. Maybe the cemetery workers had rules about offerings left too close to the graves. Perhaps they had been cleared away by mistake. Yet the thought sat uneasily in his mind. These flowers were not scattered or trampled. They were taken carefully, with no trace left behind. The toys he had placed earlier, a small doll and a wooden figurine, had also disappeared. He looked around the nearby graves, wondering if they had been misplaced or blown across the grass, but nothing appeared. The old man began to feel as though something unseen hovered around his daughter's resting place, something intruding on the sanctity of his grief. At first it was only the flowers, but soon he noticed other details. The soil at the base of the cross sometimes looked disturbed, as if pressed by feet or shifted by hands. The grass bore faint impressions, small marks as though someone had been kneeling or moving quietly there. Once, when he arrived early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen, he thought he saw shadows stretched across the cemetery, moving where no one should be. But when he blinked and looked again, there was nothing, just the silence of stone markers and the whisper of wind. He told himself it was his imagination. Grief could play tricks on man's mind. He had lived long enough to know that sorrow distorted the senses, made one see what was not there. Yet the signs continued, and with each disappearance his unease deepened. He began to mark in his mind what he had placed and when, noting carefully whether the flowers lasted a day, whether the toys remained or vanished. The pattern was clear. Each time he came, whatever he had left was gone by the following day. It was as though unseen hands came in the night to claim what belonged to his daughter. The feeling that someone had violated the grave grew stronger with every visit. The old man's heart, already fragile from loss, burned with a new kind of anguish. This was sacred ground, the last connection he had to his child, and something or someone was interfering. His first instinct was anger, the old protective force rising in him as it had when his daughter was alive and vulnerable. Who would dare touch what he had laid down in memory of her? He imagined cruel children playing tricks, vandals with no respect for the dead, perhaps even thieves who scavenged cemeteries for reasons he could not fathom. The thought of strangers' hands upon the toys she once held filled him with fury, yet beneath the anger was another feeling, heavier and more painful: fear. What if the grave itself had been disturbed? What if someone had tried to dig, to open what should never be opened? One evening, as twilight spread across the cemetery, he lingered longer than usual, studying the soil, running his fingers through the grass for signs of intrusion. Every uneven patch seemed suspicious. Every shadow felt like an intruder watching him. He walked home in the dark with unease crawling under his skin. Sleep offered no escape. He dreamed of the grave being opened, of rough hands snatching away his daughter's belongings, of her resting place desecrated. He woke with his body shaking, drenched in sweat, the image of her white casket exposed to the night burned into his mind. Each time he returned to the cemetery, he felt the same gnawing question rise in him. Who was coming here, and why? Neighbors noticed a change in him. His gait became heavier, his eyes darker. He spoke less when greeted, often distracted, as though listening for something no one else could hear. He had always been a quiet man, but now his silence carried tension, a brittle edge that made others uneasy. They pitied him, believing grief had driven him further into loneliness, but none knew of the strange signs at the grave. He told no one, fearing they would think him mad or worse, that they would dismiss it as nothing more than an old man's sorrow twisting reality. Still, he could not let go of the suspicion that something real was happening. He began to arrive at odd hours, sometimes in the dim light before dawn, sometimes late at night when the world was asleep. Each time, he hoped to catch whoever or whatever was disturbing the grave. But the cemetery lay still, silent, shrouded in shadows. Yet no matter how often he came, the pattern remained. The offerings vanished, the soil seemed shifted, the signs of unseen presence lingered. His anger deepened, but it was not anger alone. There was a strange tug in his chest, a voice he could not silence. What if it was not vandals or cruel children at play? What if it was someone desperate? Someone who came not to harm, but out of need? The thought unsettled him more than the idea of cruelty, because it awoke a sympathy he did not want to feel. He was torn between rage at the violation and sorrow for whoever might be taking what was never theirs. One night, sitting alone in his kitchen with the lamp burning low, he whispered to the empty air, asking his daughter for guidance. He told her he did not know what to do, that he felt powerless to protect her memory. His voice cracked with despair, his hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the table. The silence that followed pressed down on him, heavy as stone. He realized he could no longer live with only questions. He had to know. He had to see with his own eyes who came in the night. Thus, the first seeds of a decision began to form in his mind. He thought of ways to watch, to catch the intruder, to end the torment of not knowing. The thought filled him with dread, for it meant crossing a boundary he had never dared approach before. Yet the unease had grown too strong to ignore. His grief had given him routine, but now that routine was being shattered by an unseen force. He could not allow it to continue, and so, though he did not yet speak it aloud, the old man began to understand what he must do. He would find a way to uncover the truth, no matter how much it frightened him, no matter how heavy the guilt that weighed upon him for even considering it. The grave of his daughter had been disturbed, and he would no longer wait in silence. The stage was set for the choice that would change everything. What began as a father's daily ritual of mourning had become a mystery gnawing at the heart of his sorrow. The flowers gone, the toys vanished, the soil disturbed, all pointed toward a truth he did not yet know, a truth that waited in the shadows beyond his grief. He rose from the grave one evening with the resolve burning faintly beneath his weariness. He would no longer let the signs pass unanswered. The time had come to seek proof, to pierce the veil of night, to confront whatever hand dared touch the resting place of his beloved child. The old man returned home from the cemetery one evening with his body heavy and his mind burning. The twilight hours had stretched long, and the chill of the night clung to his bones, but it was not the cold that unsettled him. It was the gnawing certainty that the grave had once again been disturbed. The flowers he had laid the day before were gone. The soil bore fresh signs of being touched, and his heart had twisted into knots as he stood helplessly before the marble cross. He had tried to believe in ordinary explanations, but there were none left. His grief had carried him far, but now suspicion carried him further. He could no longer bear the torment of not knowing. He sat at his kitchen table, the single light bulb above his head flickering faintly, his hands resting on the worn wood. Around him the house was silent, too silent, for it no longer carried the echoes of his daughter's laughter, no longer bore the soft sounds of life. Only his thoughts stirred, circling like vultures above his weariness. Again and again, he asked himself if he was imagining the signs, if sorrow had twisted his perception so badly that he saw ghosts where there were none. Yet he knew with the certainty of a father's heart that this was not illusion. Something or someone came to his daughter's resting place, and the offerings he left in her memory did not vanish into thin air. In his youth he had been a man of action, never one to sit idle when something needed to be done. But age had slowed him, grief had bent him, and he found himself questioning not only what was happening but also whether he had the strength to face the answer. What if he discovered cruelty? What if his daughter's grave had become a target for mockery, a playground for reckless hands? The thought made him sick with rage. Yet beneath that anger was a deeper fear. What if he discovered something he could not bear? What if the truth was worse than his imagination? For days he wrestled with himself. He lingered longer at the cemetery, peering into shadows as though his eyes alone might reveal the intruder. He returned at odd hours, his feet carrying him to the grave in the darkness before dawn, or in the stillness of midnight. Each time he found nothing but silence, and each time his despair deepened. He was an old man, too frail to hide in the cold and wait endlessly, too broken to chase shadows. Yet he could not let the question rest. The decision, when it finally came, did not strike him like lightning. It crept slowly, like a tide rising at night, until he realized he was already standing in its waters. He began to think of ways he could watch without being present, of tools that could serve where his weary body could not. It felt wrong to even imagine it, to picture placing a device at the sacred place where his daughter lay, but the thought returned to him relentlessly. A camera. A silent eye that could see where his own could not, that could keep vigil over her when he was absent. The very idea made his heart twist with guilt. To disturb the sanctity of her grave with such a contrivance felt like a betrayal. Yet his need for truth clawed at him with merciless hands. Night after night he argued with himself. Sitting alone at the table, he would whisper to the air as though she could hear him, confessing his torment. He told her he was sorry, that he did not want to break the peace she deserved, but that he could not bear to imagine strangers defiling her memory. He begged her forgiveness, his voice breaking, as if already anticipating her disapproval. But each morning, when he saw the bare earth where flowers should have been, his resolve hardened. If he truly loved her, if he was the father he had always promised to be, then he must protect her resting place. And to protect it, he had to know the truth. The day he sought help felt like walking across a threshold. He approached an old acquaintance, a man who once worked with him years ago and who now dealt in electronics. It had been decades since they had shared a drink, and the old man's voice trembled as he asked if such a thing could be done. His acquaintance looked at him with surprise, not understanding at first why an aged widower would want such a device. But the old man explained only that he needed a way to see something at night, a way to know who came when he was not there. The other man did not press for details. He provided a small camera, one meant for security, with a battery that would last for days and a lens that could pierce the shadows. It was not much larger than a matchbox, light enough to hide. The old man carried it home in his pocket as though it were a stone of great weight. He placed it on the table that night and stared at it for hours, his heart pounding. It seemed to stare back at him. This cold piece of machinery, a thing of wires and glass, so alien against the warmth of his daughter's memory. He touched it with trembling fingers, wondering if he truly had the right. Could he desecrate her resting place in this way? Could he place an unfeeling eye in the soil that covered her? Each doubt struck him with the force of grief anew. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw the vanished flowers, the missing toys, the marks in the earth. And he knew he could not stop. The night he finally carried the camera to the cemetery, the air was cold and the moon was hidden behind clouds. The silence of the graves pressed against him as he walked the familiar path, his footsteps slow and burdened. He reached the marble cross and knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he brushed away leaves. He spoke softly into the darkness, as though to his daughter. He told her he was sorry, that he needed her forgiveness, that what he was about to do was not meant to harm, but to protect. His voice cracked as tears blurred his vision, but he did not stop. He carefully placed the camera, nestling it among the soil and the small shrubs nearby, painting it with dirt until it blended into the night. When it was done, he sat back on his heels, his chest aching with the weight of his choice. He stared at the grave, the white cross faint in the darkness, and felt the crushing guilt of a father who feared he had gone too far. Yet, beneath the guilt was a flicker of determination. For the first time in months, he had taken a step toward action rather than surrender. He had placed an eye where his own could not be. Now, all that remained was to wait. As he walked home through the silent streets, his mind swirled with unease. The guilt was sharp, but so was the hope. Soon he would know. Soon the shadows would reveal themselves. Whether the truth brought rage or sorrow, at least he would no longer be blind. He whispered one last prayer into the night, not only for his daughter's peace, but for strength to face whatever the camera might show him. And thus, with the weight of both love and fear pressing on his soul, the old man set into motion the act that would unravel the mystery haunting his grief. The grave would no longer keep its secrets. The old man lived the following days in a state of restless anticipation, each hour dragging against his nerves as though time itself had grown cruel. He carried on his visits to the cemetery with the same devotion as before, kneeling at the grave, arranging flowers, speaking into the silence as if his daughter could still hear his voice. But now, behind every word, there was the pulse of another thought, louder and louder. The camera was watching. He had placed his trust in that small, silent device, and though guilt still weighed heavily on him, curiosity gnawed deeper. For the first time since her passing, he felt himself moving towards something, no matter how dreadful that something might be. At first, he resisted checking the footage too soon, telling himself he must allow days to pass, must give the unseen intruders a chance to appear. But the temptation proved unbearable. Each night he returned home from the grave, the house silent around him, and sat at his table staring at the recorder as though it might whisper its secrets on its own. Sleep eluded him. He dozed for short, troubled moments, waking often with his heart hammering, haunted by dreams of shadows bending over his daughter's grave, dreams of hands pulling her gifts away into darkness. Finally, after a week of torment, he could bear no more. He connected the device and began to watch. The first hours of footage tested his patience, showing only the black stillness of night, broken occasionally by the flicker of a moth or the shifting of tree branches in the wind. He leaned closer to the screen, his breath shallow, listening to the faint hum of the recording, searching desperately for anything out of place. Days appeared and passed, captured in the monotony of empty silence. Yet he knew it could not all be nothing. He had seen the missing flowers with his own eyes. He pressed forward, the tension in his chest building with every frame. Then, without warning, movement emerged. At first, it was nothing more than shadows flitting along the far edge of the cemetery. His heart leapt, and he paused, afraid to breathe. He let the video roll on. Slowly, shapes began to form from the darkness, figures small and hesitant, drifting between the stones like ghosts. He thought for a moment that his grief had finally broken his mind, for they were not men, not vandals with cruel laughter. They were children. He pressed a trembling hand against his mouth as his eyes widened, the shapes resolving into fragile bodies and pale faces. There were 4, perhaps 5 of them, boys and girls, their ages difficult to tell in the weak light, but none older than their early teens. Their clothes were worn and torn, hanging from them in ragged layers, far too thin for the chill of night. Their steps were slow, careful, almost reverent as they moved toward the white cross that marked his daughter's grave. The old man's heart twisted violently within him. He had expected monsters, cruel and heartless hands desecrating the memory of his child. Instead, he saw thin limbs, hollow eyes, and silence. The children made no sound as they approached, their faces grave, their bodies lean with hunger. One boy knelt first, his small hands brushing across the mound of earth. From the recording, the man could not hear him, but the gesture was clear, a touch so careful it brought tears to his eyes. Another girl lifted a toy from where he had placed it days before. She cradled it against her chest, not with glee but with a kind of sorrow, as though holding a treasure she did not deserve. The group lingered together at the grave, none of them speaking, none smiling. Their silence was heavier than words. They moved as if they understood that they should not be there, yet were drawn to the place by something beyond themselves. The boy who had first knelt picked up the flowers, their colors faded but still bright against his hands. He stared at them with a seriousness far beyond his years. Then, astonishingly, he placed something down in return, a folded scrap of paper, which he tucked carefully against the base of the cross before stepping back. The old man could no longer stop his tears. He wiped at them furiously, ashamed of his own weakness, yet unable to contain the flood of emotion breaking loose inside him. These were not vandals. They were not mocking his daughter's memory. They were children, lost and homeless, clinging to the little tokens of love and comfort they found at her grave. He could see their hunger in the hollowness of their cheeks, their exhaustion in the way they leaned on one another. They had come not to destroy, but to take into their lives some fragment of the love he had left for his daughter. Still, the sight broke him in ways he had not expected. To think of them rifling through the things he placed for his child felt unbearable. The gifts were meant for her, tokens of his devotion, offerings of remembrance. To see them lifted by strange hands stirred in him both anger and despair. Yet, when he looked again at their pale faces, the anger drained away, leaving only sorrow. They were not thieves. They were survivors, children adrift in a world that had abandoned them. And they had chosen his daughter's grave as a place of refuge, a sanctuary where they could touch kindness even in death. He stopped the video and sat back, his breath uneven. His heart ached with confusion, torn between the fury of a father and the pity of a man who knew what it was to be alone. He replayed the footage again, unable to stop himself, watching their every movement, studying their gestures. Each time his anger weakened, and each time his sorrow grew deeper. At last he could no longer deny what his eyes had seen. The mystery was solved, yet the answer was not the relief he had expected. There was no cruelty here, no malice, only suffering. The old man pressed his palms over his face, and for the first time in many years he sobbed openly, the sound raw and harsh in the silence of his empty house. He thought of his daughter, of the softness of her heart, of the way she would have reached out to these children had she still been alive. She had always been the one to give her toys to others, to share her drawings, to offer smiles even to strangers. She would not have seen enemies in these children. She would have seen souls in need. That thought pierced him like a blade. What would she think of him if he turned to anger, if he saw only violation where there was suffering? The memory of her gentle eyes rose before him, and he felt ashamed of the bitterness that had first flooded him when he discovered the truth. No, she would have wanted him to see with compassion. She would have wanted him to open his hands, not close them. The footage ended with the children slipping quietly back into the darkness, carrying the flowers and toys with them, leaving only that folded scrap of paper behind. The old man stared at the final frame long after it had frozen, the emptiness of the cemetery filling his vision, the weight of the revelation heavy on his shoulders. The mystery had been answered, but it left him standing at a crossroads. He could not call the police on starving children, could not rage at them for seeking solace. Yet he also could not ignore the ache in his chest when he saw the gifts meant for his daughter taken away. He sat in his chair until dawn, caught in the turmoil of his own heart, his eyes red with grief and sleeplessness. When the sun finally rose, spilling light across the silent streets, he whispered into the emptiness of his kitchen words meant for his daughter. He told her he had seen the truth, that he had watched the children with his own eyes, that he did not know how to feel. His voice broke as he admitted his sorrow, but he promised her he would not harden his heart. He would not turn his grief into bitterness. If these children had come to her grave seeking love, then perhaps that was the last gift she could give, even in death. The old man closed the recorder and pressed his trembling hands against it as though it were a sacred object. The footage had changed everything. He could never again look at the grave without remembering the thin faces and quiet steps of those who visited in the night. He had set out to protect his daughter's memory, but what he found instead was a mirror of his own loneliness, reflected in the eyes of children who had no home. And though he did not yet know it, the decision he would soon make, to answer their need with kindness rather than anger, would transform not only the nights at the cemetery but the very shape of his grief. The footage had revealed the shadows, and within those shadows he had seen not enemies, but broken souls. It was the most shocking truth of all, that love could be stolen and yet multiplied, taken and yet reborn in the hearts of others. The days after he watched the footage were unlike any he had lived before. For months, his grief had been a steady rhythm, painful but predictable, a sorrow that repeated itself with each visit to the cemetery. Now it had been broken wide open. He no longer walked to his daughter's grave with only flowers and whispered prayers in his hands. He carried the weight of what he had seen, the image of thin children moving silently through the night, their eyes hollow yet reverent, their hands taking what he had left for his beloved child. It gnawed at him with a cruel persistence, and his heart swung violently between emotions he could barely contain. At times, anger rose in him, fierce and protective, the instinct of a father unwilling to see his daughter's resting place disturbed. He would sit in his chair at night, his fists clenched, imagining confronting them, demanding to know why they had dared to touch what was sacred. He thought of his daughter's toys being lifted from the soil by strangers, her flowers clutched by hands that had never known her. The anger made his body tremble, and in those moments he felt the old fire that had carried him through hardship, the force that had kept him working when his back had screamed with pain. Yet, just as quickly, the anger dissolved into something else, something heavier and harder to endure. He would remember their faces, pale in the camera's dim light, their silence more eloquent than words, and sorrow would flood him. They had not laughed, had not played. They had moved as though the weight of the world pressed down on their small shoulders. They were not vandals mocking his grief. They were children stripped of safety, searching for comfort where none had been given to them. And in their small gestures, in the careful way the boy placed a folded scrap of paper at the grave, he had seen a respect that shook him. It was not desecration. It was desperation. This conflict tore at him day after day. He carried it with him when he walked to the cemetery, when he stood at the grave, when he whispered to the marble cross as though it could answer him. He confessed it to his daughter, pouring his thoughts into the air, his voice trembling with guilt. He told her he did not know what to feel, that his heart was torn in two. He had promised to protect her, even in death, and yet he felt her spirit urging him toward compassion rather than rage. He remembered her childhood kindness, how she would give away her own toys to friends or even to children she barely knew, how she would smile and say, "They need it more than I do." That memory haunted him now, pressing against his anger until it cracked. But there were nights when doubt consumed him. He would pace the floor of his empty house, muttering to himself, asking if he had failed her. Was he weak for not defending her grave with all his strength? Was he betraying her memory by allowing others to touch what was meant for her? The thought drove him nearly mad. He wanted to do right by her, but the path was no longer clear. The footage had stolen from him the simplicity of anger and replaced it with the torment of conscience. Neighbors noticed the change in him. His shoulders seemed heavier, his steps slower. His eyes, already dulled by grief, now carried a new weight, as if he were haunted by something unseen. When they greeted him on the street, he barely responded, lost in thought. They pitied him, believing he was simply sinking deeper into the sorrow of losing his only child. None could guess the truth, that he was battling himself, his heart at war between vengeance and mercy. He returned again and again to the footage, replaying it late at night when the silence of the house became unbearable. Each time, the same faces appeared, the same frail movements, the same solemn silence. Each time he watched them with new eyes, seeking something he had missed before. Sometimes he thought he saw guilt in their expressions, as if they knew they were trespassing. Other times he thought he saw reverence, as if they treated the grave not as a place to steal from, but as a shrine to which they had been drawn. The more he watched, the less certain he became of anything, except that his heart could not rest. One evening, he sat by the grave longer than usual, the sun sinking low as shadows stretched across the stones. He placed fresh flowers at the cross and then remained kneeling, his hands clasped tightly, his lips moving with words too soft for anyone but the earth to hear. He begged for a sign, for guidance, for some clarity to cut through the fog of his torment. The wind stirred the branches above him, carrying the scent of soil and grass, but no answer came. Only the silence pressed against him, and in that silence he thought again of the children, of their thin frames and their silent exit into the night. The thought came to him then, unbidden but undeniable. Perhaps this was not a violation, but a chance. Perhaps these children had not stolen from his daughter, but had been drawn to her grave by something he could not see, some lingering warmth of her presence. Perhaps his loss could become their comfort. The idea frightened him, for it felt like surrender, as though he were giving away what belonged to her. Yet at the same time, it stirred something in him, a faint light in the endless darkness of his grief. Could it be that even in death, his daughter still had the power to touch lives? That night, he could not sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind turning over the same thought until it grew into resolve. He could not call the police. He could not chase them away like vermin. To do so would be to betray not only the memory of his daughter, but the very lessons she had lived by. He remembered her gentle voice, her given nature, and he knew deep inside that she would want him to show kindness. It was the hardest decision he had ever faced, harder even than the day he buried her, for it meant reshaping his grief into something unfamiliar. Yet, as the hours passed and dawn crept pale through his window, he felt his heart settle, not in peace but in determination. He would not turn away from what he had seen. He would not let his anger consume him. If these children had come to her grave seeking comfort, then he would give them comfort. If they needed food, he would provide it. If they needed warmth, he would bring it. He would turn the grave from a place of sorrow into a place of mercy. Still, the decision did not erase his pain. Each step of this new path carried guilt, as though he were giving away pieces of his daughter's memory to strangers. But alongside the guilt was a strange, quiet hope, a sense that perhaps this was not betrayal, but fulfillment, that in helping them he was honoring her more deeply than flowers or toys ever could. He clung to that thought as he prepared himself for what he would do next. The struggle within him did not end, but it had transformed. Where once he had been torn between rage and sorrow, now he felt himself pulled between despair and purpose. He did not know what would come of his choice, but he knew he could not return to silence. The children had changed him, as his daughter once had, and he could no longer ignore the truth his own eyes had revealed. And so, with his heart still heavy, yet his mind resolved, he stepped forward into a new chapter of his grief, one in which sorrow would not be his only companion. He would act, and in acting he would discover whether love could indeed reach beyond death, shaping not only his life, but the lives of those lost children who had wandered into his world of mourning. When the old man awoke the morning after his long night of torment, his decision was no longer fragile or uncertain. It had taken root within him like a tree in stony ground, hard and immovable. He would not call the police. He would not chase those children into the shadows as if they were thieves. The image of their hollow eyes and silent steps haunted him, and though part of him still flinched with pain at the thought of strangers touching what was meant for his daughter, a stronger part had begun to stir, the part that remembered her kindness, her open hands, her gentle heart. He knew she would not have turned those children away. She would have smiled at them, offered her toys, pressed flowers into their palms, told them they were not alone. If she were still alive, she would have acted with compassion, and he could not do less in her memory. For the first time in months, he walked to the cemetery with something more than flowers in his hands. The familiar ache accompanied him, of course, the ache of grief that never left, but beside it now was the weight of 2 large bags slung over his arms. Inside them were things he had gathered the night before. Food enough to fill hungry bellies, blankets to shield against the cold, clothes his daughter had outgrown, but that he had carefully kept folded in drawers all these years. Each item was a piece of the life he had once built for her, now transformed into gifts for children who had nothing. His heart beat fast as he walked, for the gesture felt at once right and unbearable. When he reached the grave, he knelt as he always did, laying flowers at the cross, whispering a greeting to his daughter. But then, with hands trembling, he placed the bags at the base of the mound. He arranged them as carefully as he once arranged her toys, as though presentation mattered, as though the children would see and understand the care with which he had prepared this offering. He spoke aloud, his voice low but steady, telling his daughter that this was for her, that through her he would try to ease the suffering of others. His words caught in his throat, but he pressed on, promising that he would honor her memory not by clutching it tightly to himself, but by letting it radiate outward, even to strangers. The act felt strange, even sacrilegious, as he rose to his feet and walked away, leaving behind not only flowers for his daughter, but provisions for the children. He looked back several times, his steps faltering. He feared that what he had done might cheapen the sanctity of the grave, that he had turned a place of mourning into something else. Yet, as he reached the cemetery gate, a quiet voice inside him, whether memory or something more, whispered that he had done right. The days that followed tested his resolve. Each visit carried with it a mixture of dread and hope. He wondered if the children would return, if they would see what he had left, if they would understand that the gifts were for them. On the 3rd day, when he came again, his heart nearly stopped. The bags were gone. In their place, resting gently against the marble cross, was a folded note. His hands shook as he picked it up, the paper smudged and thin, the handwriting uneven. There were only 2 words written there, scrawled in a child's hand. "Thank you." Tears blurred his vision as he pressed the note to his chest. He stood there for a long time, his breath ragged, feeling as though his daughter were beside him, smiling. It was such a small thing, those 2 words, and yet they carried the weight of something immense. They told him that the children had understood, that they had felt the care in his gesture, that they had not taken blindly, but received with gratitude. The note was proof that kindness had reached across the divide between his grief and their need. From that day on, his visits to the grave were forever changed. He still brought flowers, still spoke to his daughter, still wept in the quiet moments when the ache of her absence grew unbearable. But now he also brought other things: bags of food, jars of water, blankets thick enough to ward off the night. He began to collect toys, some saved from his daughter's childhood, others bought with the few dollars he could spare. Each offering he placed with the same reverence as he placed the flowers, arranging them neatly, whispering that they were a part of her legacy now. And the children came. He never saw them with his own eyes, for they moved only in the hours of darkness, but he knew they came. Each time he returned, the offerings were gone, and, in their place, small tokens appeared. A drawing of a house, crude but full of color. A bracelet woven from bits of string. A feather tied with thread. They were not gifts of value in the eyes of the world, but to him they were treasures, signs of life reaching back to him. The children were not only taking, they were giving too, giving what little they could as if to say, "We see you, we thank you, we are not ungrateful." This strange exchange brought him a peace he had not thought possible. For months he had lived with only emptiness, his days bound to grief, his nights haunted by silence. Now, though his sorrow remained, it was no longer barren. It had been reshaped into something living, something that touched others. He began to walk with a little more strength in his step, his shoulders less bent. Neighbors noticed the faint change and wondered if perhaps his grief was finally easing. They could not know the truth, that his daughter's grave had become not only a place of mourning, but a place of quiet mercy, where love flowed outward into the night and returned to him in unexpected ways. Yet, even as he embraced this new path, he remained aware of the fragility of it. The children were still out there, cold and hungry, their lives marked by hardship he could not erase with blankets and bread. At times, the thought overwhelmed him, and he wept for them as he wept for his daughter, grieving not only what he had lost, but what the world had denied these young souls. But then he would look at the tokens they left behind, the crooked drawings, the simple words of thanks, and he would feel his daughter's presence, as though she approved, as though she had guided him toward this path. The old man no longer asked himself whether he was betraying her memory. He knew now that he was fulfilling it. In giving to those children, he was giving as she would have given, loving as she would have loved. His grief had not diminished, but it had been transformed, carrying within it the faint glimmer of hope. He understood that love, once born, never truly dies. It can be taken, shared, multiplied, passed on even in the shadow of death. And so, day by day, he continued. He tended his daughter's grave with flowers and with gifts for the children, and in return, he received not only their gratitude, but the quiet certainty that her spirit lived on through every act of kindness. What had begun as an unbearable violation had become a sacred ritual, a bond between his sorrow and their survival. He had chosen a new path, and though it was not the life he had wanted, it was the life he had, and he walked it with the strength of a father who still, even in loss, could give. The seasons turned slowly, each day folding into the next, yet for the old man, life no longer felt like an endless repetition of grief. His daughter was still gone, the ache of her absence still sharp whenever he awoke in the quiet of his home, but there was something new in the rhythm of his days. His steps to the cemetery no longer carried only sorrow, they carried purpose. The marble cross that had once been only a reminder of loss now stood as the center of something greater. It was still her resting place, sacred and irreplaceable, but it had become more than that. It had become a place of mercy, a place where love extended beyond the boundaries of one life and touched others who needed it most. Each visit he made was marked by the same ritual. He laid flowers at the grave, sometimes bought from the market, sometimes plucked from the roadside, sometimes gathered from his small backyard. They were still for her, tokens of remembrance, whispers of devotion carried in the petals. Beside them he placed the gifts for the children, food wrapped carefully in cloth, bread he had baked in the early morning, fruit carried in small baskets, blankets folded neatly, toys either preserved from her childhood or found in thrift shops where he spent what little money he could spare. Each item was arranged with deliberate care, as though presentation gave dignity to the act. He would pause then, his hands pressed against the marble, and speak to her softly, telling her that the gifts were hers as much as his, that together they were offering comfort to those who wandered in the night. The children never appeared when he was there. They remained shadows moving under the cover of darkness, but he knew they came. Each time he returned, the food was gone, the blankets taken, the toys lifted by small, unseen hands. And each time, in their place, there was something left behind. At first, it had been simple. A note scrawled with thanks, a rough drawing of a house, a bracelet made of string. But as the weeks passed, the tokens grew more numerous. Crude sketches on scraps of paper, folded origami figures made from discarded packaging, stones polished by hand until they shone faintly in the light. They were gifts of poverty, yet they carried more weight than gold, for they spoke of gratitude, of recognition, of a bond forming quietly in the shadows. The old man kept every single one. At first he placed them on his mantel, then on shelves he cleared for the purpose. Soon his small house became a gallery of these offerings, each one a reminder that kindness had not been swallowed by despair. Neighbors who visited saw the tokens and asked what they meant, but he never gave more than a quiet smile. The story was not theirs to know. It belonged to him, to his daughter, and to the children who had found refuge at her grave. With time, the act transformed him. Where once he had moved through the world, bent and silent, his eyes fixed only on sorrow, now there was a quiet strength in his steps. His neighbors noticed the change, though they could not name its cause. They said he seemed lighter, though his face was still lined with grief, as if he carried something beyond sadness now, something that gave him reason to rise each morning. They saw him walk to the market with a steadier gait, his hands carrying bags of bread and fruit, his eyes clear with determination. They assumed he had finally begun to heal from his loss. They did not know that his healing was not in forgetting, but in giving. On one of his visits, he found something that shook him more than all the other tokens. Resting against the base of the cross was a small notebook, worn and frayed. Inside were pages filled with the handwriting of different children, some clumsy, some surprisingly neat. They had written words to him, to his daughter, to the grave itself. Messages of thanks, of longing, of stories half told. One child wrote of hunger and how the food had kept him alive another night. Another wrote of fear, of sleeping in abandoned buildings and finding solace only at the grave. A girl had drawn a picture of his daughter's cross, adorned with flowers, and beneath it had written the words, "She is our angel." The old man wept as he read, his tears falling onto the fragile pages. He held the notebook to his chest, overwhelmed by the realization that his daughter's memory had reached beyond him, beyond the cemetery, beyond death itself. She had become something to these children, a figure of hope, a guardian in their eyes. And through them, she lived on. This revelation deepened his commitment. He began to prepare larger offerings, not only food and blankets, but small bundles of supplies, soap, bandages, candles. He wanted them to know they were cared for, that someone in the world saw them, that they were not invisible. In return, the children left more notes, more drawings, more fragments of themselves. He never met them face to face, but the bond between them grew stronger, woven from acts of giving and receiving, of silent communication across the boundary of day and night. The old man understood now that grief could be more than pain. It could be transformed into something living, something that reached outward instead of folding inward. He would never stop mourning his daughter, never stop missing the sound of her laughter or the feel of her small hand in his. But through the children, he found a way to honor her, to let her kindness echo into the world. She had been taken too soon, but her spirit continued to shape lives, to offer light in the darkest corners. On a quiet evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the old man sat by the grave longer than usual. He placed his hands on the marble cross and whispered that he felt her presence. He told her that she was still changing the world, that her love had not died with her, that it lived on in the gratitude of children she had never met. His voice shook as he promised her that he would continue, for as long as his body allowed, to carry this legacy forward. And in that moment, he felt a peace unlike any he had known since her passing. The cemetery no longer seemed a place only of death, but a place of life reborn. The grave was no longer only a symbol of loss, but a beacon of mercy. His daughter's memory had become a bridge between his grief and the world's need, and through it he had found a measure of healing. When he rose to leave, he looked back at the marble cross, the flowers, the tokens left by unseen hands. He smiled faintly through his tears. He knew that when his own time came, he would go to her not as a man broken by sorrow, but as a father who had carried her light into the darkness of the world. His love had not ended with her death. It had expanded, flowing outward to touch lives he would never fully know. That was her gift to him, and, through him, to the children who wandered the night. The old man walked home slowly, but his steps no longer felt as heavy as they once had. He carried with him the certainty that his daughter's legacy was no longer only his to bear. It belonged now to every child who had found warmth at her grave, to every note of thanks, to every crude drawing left in the night. It was a legacy of love, stronger than death, enduring beyond grief, alive in every act of kindness that had been born from loss. And in that truth, he finally found the strength to live. If this story touched your heart, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story. Turn on the notification bell and join our community of viewers from all around the world. And before you go, share this video with someone you care about, because stories like this one deserve to be heard. Now keep watching. Another incredible story is waiting for you right here on the channel.